In the Intro to Mark video, I know that I gave you a couple of big handles on working through the book, some big questions that are being addressed, as well as kind of some key literary features. One of the things that we're looking at doing is that periodically throughout the series to give you kind of some structural things that as you read the text that you understand, oh, this is what Mark is trying to communicate from a literary perspective and a structural perspective, and how he put these different sermons or stories that he heard from Peter together. So let's take a look at chapter 1. As I mentioned before in the intro video, is that the first section of this gospel really runs from 1:1 to about the middle of chapter 8. And that this section of the Gospel of Mark is all about asking the question, who is Jesus? Is he the Messiah of Israel? Is he something else? Is he demon-possessed? Is he a prophet? Who is this Jesus? Is he crazy? And so these first 7.5 chapters of the Gospel of Mark are looking at answering that question. Who is Jesus? So we see this right away, right in chapter 1. Mark shares with us that information that he says this is the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So Mark shares that with us up front, but we need to remember nobody else in the narrative knows that yet, is that we are privileged to have that information before we read anything else in the book. But that chapter 1 starts to unpack some of that question. John the Baptist comes proclaiming that Jesus is this Messiah, that we see Jesus starting to preach, and then we have these series of narratives where he calls people to be his disciples. But then starting from verse 21 in chapter 1, that we start to see these things where Jesus is starting to be identified by people other than the Baptist who had this kind of unique ministry that God had given him. In chapter 1, verse 21 through 28, Jesus heals a man or casts out an unclean spirit in the synagogue at Capernaum. The demon says to Jesus, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." You see, the demon is starting to address who is this Jesus. He is the Holy One of God, the Holy One of Israel. Interestingly, Jesus tells the demon to be silent and to not say it anymore. It continues throughout this, that this Holy One of God starts to demonstrate authority that only God has. And that starts first with the casting out of a demon. Then later in chapter 1, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, healing other people with diseases in Capernaum and those casting out more demons. And then finally, the cleansing of a leper at the end of chapter 1. And then it continues into chapter 2, and we'll get there later. But that I want us to focus on chapter 1 for right now, is that this chapter is already starting to address the big question, who is Jesus? Is he really the one that God is sending into the world to save the world as the Messiah of Israel? Read chapter 1. Take the time to read it. See how that question is already starting to be addressed by Mark in the text. See how Jesus is commanding authority that only God alone has already in the book of Mark as you are being pressed about the question, who is Jesus?